Welcome to Podcast 83, a regular look at the news, stories, and trends related to Michigan's 83 counties from the Michigan Association of Counties.
All right, everyone, welcome to Podcast 83, the podcast put on by the Michigan Association of Counties. Today, we've joined by Deena Bosworth and Samantha Gibson of the MAC staff. And today, we're going to focus on one of the issues we've been working on for quite some time now. The Trial Court Funding Commission recommendations, and specifically that funding component that we've hit some bumps in the road, had some extensions to the ability to charge those fees. But want to talk about it a little more in depth today on where we're at right now. So right now, I'm going to turn it over to Samantha. Sam, why don't you tell us a little bit about where we've been, kind of the path, the road we've been on, and what the expectation or scenarios are maybe going forward. And I'm sure Deena will have some comments as well.
Absolutely. So the trial court funding issue dates back to 2017, when the Michigan Supreme Court ruled that judges didn't have the authority to impose fines and fees on criminal defendants solely because there was nothing in statute allowing them to do so. So the legislative fix at that time was to implement statute and put a sunset on it for October of 2020. And Governor Snyder simultaneously created the Trial Court Funding Commission. The Funding Commission met, came up with their recommendations, provided them to the legislature in 19. We all know what happened in 2020 with COVID and the pandemic. So that October 2020 sunset came and went, and the recommendations weren't implemented. And so they extended that sunset to October of 2022. Really, the same thing took place in that 2-year span. No recommendations were enacted. And so we once again extended that sunset to May of 2024. That was the governor's recommendation, that we had that in line for budget season so that the funding piece for the trial courts would be there. The current circumstance is there's another case before the Supreme Court to determine the constitutionality of judges imposing these fees at all, regardless of statute. The assumption is that MSC will rule against judges imposing those fees. And so we have two plans, really. Plan A and best case scenario is that the recommendations from the Trial Court Funding Commission are enacted by the legislature prior to Michigan Supreme Court's ruling. And then we avoid this financial catastrophe for the courts where MSC rules, there's no funding in place, and counties are really left to foot the bill for that. It's over a quarter of courts' operational funding that comes from those fines and fees on criminal defendants. So again, that's best case scenario. The Funding Commission's recommendations are enacted. Plan B is in the event that the Supreme Court rules prior to the enactment of those recommendations. MAC has requested, and I've been making the rounds with legislators, making them aware of this, just one-time $46 million funding, whether that comes from a supplemental, whatever it may be, to make sure that our courts have operational funding and counties aren't responsible to backfill that in the meantime. And then once we have that funding, we can get back to work on implementing the Funding Commission's recommendations.
So Sam, how close are we to getting the funding recommendations, the Trial Court Funding Commission recommendations introduced and moved? I mean, we've talked about them. They've been drafted for years, and there's never really been any movement. So how close are we? Is there opposition to them? Kind of what's holding them up?
No known opposition. And I mean, I've had very positive feedback from legislators, even members who are saying they're willing to take this on. I think the biggest leap here is just the amount of stakeholders involved. And a lot of the recommendations put administrative burden on the state court administrator's office. So there's that to consider. SCAO has to weigh in and really approve of these things before they take them on. There's also, the recommendations were provided in 2019. It's 4 years ago now, so best practices may have changed. So it's going to take some time to go back into the policy and dig into that and figure what do we want it to look like today.
So how do those bills fix that $46 million gap if we lose the ability to charge those fees? Do those bills require state general fund dollars? How does that work?
So two of the recommendations that would create two bills would address the funding problem. One of them is for the state to create what's called the Trial Court Fund, where general fund dollars would be used to fund local courts' operational fees. And there's language in there to ensure that, local discretion remains local within the courts and the judges. And then the second piece of that is establishing uniform assessments and centralized collections through the state court administrator's office. Right now, we have a decentralized collection system. Some judges will waive the fees, or, oftentimes the fee itself isn't worth the effort that goes into collecting it. So, in one court or one county, you're not responsible for those fees, it's been waived. And another court or county, you are responsible for that. So centralizing those collections will play a part, and then also uniform assessments, same thing. You could be charged or a different fine or fee depending on the charge you've been given, various by the court. So doing that through the state court administrator's office will alleviate the burden on local courts, and they'll be ensuring that those fees are collected rather than waived on a case-by-case basis.
That kind of makes sense. So that's a little bit more of courts are in the business of law enforcement and adjudicating issues, and not necessarily bill collectors, right? That's going to
Absolutely.
ease up a lot of pressure. That makes sense.
And
That
those
makes sense.
out of that fund, those funds would be distributed based on caseload or population, or how would those funds be distributed?
I'm not exactly sure. I think they would take the current collections that are in place, which is also how we came to that $46 million ask, where on an annual basis, it varies from, could be 40, some years it's over $50 million collected in those fines and fees on criminal defendants. So scale will say, okay, this is the individual amount that courts have collected and imposed over the years. This is the total amount we need, and it'll be distributed based on that basis. So probably more so like a caseload basis than population, I think.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So, do we think that these bills then still need a lot of time? I mean, there's probably not much time yet before summer to get these, really in good shape. So, what is your gut feeling on when the Supreme Court's going to make a decision? Do you have any thoughts on that? Of course, crystal ball-ish. That's not really fair to put on you. Nobody really knows when they're going to do it, but are you hearing rumors? What are you thinking?
I think, they don't have, well, I know that they don't have a timeline that they have to decide by. And granted, they're not supposed to take into consideration what the legislature's doing, but the hope is that is in the back of their minds, and we want to avoid this crisis. So given that, and there are no hard timeline on when they have to decide, and they've had oral arguments March 1st, don't think it's going to be anytime soon. And yes, to your point, these bills won't be done before summer break. I don't think it's unrealistic to say by the end of 2023 to have traction on those. But like you said, crystal ball, I can't say.
Right, crystal ball, different priorities. That makes sense. So really, it is critical for us to get this $46 million, at least, right in everyone's mind that, hey, the courts are going to need this to keep operations as is, because that's a huge hit to county budgets for sure. Now, we're hearing maybe a supplemental again before they enact the fiscal year 24 budget, but so in a supplemental, you think it would be the best bet as opposed to waiting till October for these funds?
I do think so. Yeah. I mean,
Okay.
in the event that we have, it's in the FY24 budget versus a supplemental. I mean, if MSC rules before those FY24 dollars go out, counties are going to be responsible for that funding in the meantime.
Yeah.
Well, and with regards to the bigger legislation, the trial court funding in general, I mean, we got a whole new education process you're gonna have to start too, because it's a whole new legislature. There are a few folks around, you have the Representative Leitners, you've got some people like that were part of the original work group, but man, there are a lot of new legislators out there too. So that's another, and we're working on budget now, and then you have summer break and then getting into the fall. So it's gonna be a lot of work to get it done legislatively.
It will be. Oh, go ahead, Deena.
No, I was just going to ask about the chairs of the, is this going to be an appropriations issue, do you think, for the trial court funding bills, through appropriations or through judicial committees? What are you thinking?
I see it going through judiciary appropriations. I mean, there are policy pieces, but ultimately it's a lot of budgetary concerns. So I see it going through judiciary approps. I've had positive feedback and interest really from the members that I've met with that serve on those committees. So there are lawmakers that are willing to take on this issue for us, some former county commissioners in the legislature who are willing to speak up and, potentially sponsor bills. So far, so good in that regard.
That's
Good.
awesome.
Good.
That's awesome.
Well, it looks like we've got, some superficial deadlines, I guess you could say, coming up with a decision at the Supreme Court, which we don't really know it's going to be. Of course, we got legislation being worked on at the same time. Still a very important topic, and thanks, Sam, for keeping track of it. And I'm sure we'll keep folks updated as it moves through the various judiciary process, the legislative process. We'll keep everyone updated through our legislative update, probably in our podcasts as well. So, Sam, Deena, anything else before we close things out?
I don't think so. I don't
All
think
right.
so.
All right.
Nope,
Well,
nothing
great.
more from me.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great
Thanks,
day.
Steve.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Podcast 83.